Welcome to the Arthur Griffith Annual Lecture. After 2 years we have returned, and this year we're going to concentrate on Griffith himself and the work he did, especially within County Cavan politically, and how the Cavan people responded to the success of one of our greatest men of the last century. After the Williamite Wars, many Ulster Scots left Ulster and went to America, leaving a very oppressive financial and political life behind them. They were hoping for better things. The ascendancy were left without tenants, so they had to look for tenants, but they were reluctant to lease their lands to Catholics. This led to the second plantation of Ulster between roughly 1895 to 1722. In 1708, John Griffith from North Wales came to County Monaghan, where he leased lands from a Willoughby Montgomery family, a family that had tranches of land throughout Fermanagh and Monaghan from the Confederate Wars. A lot of people brought to England were either Anglicans, Methodists or Scottish Episcopalians. The Catholics wanted to be out of the fold to keep the ascendancy secure. And the plantation was very controlled. The Griffiths very soon moved into County Cavan and bought lands at Ballyhaise and let and sublet these lands. John Griffith himself died in 1741 and is interred in the old ruins of the Church of Ireland at Drumswords, County Monaghan. It's worth a visit and his grave is very visible. Now, the Griffiths got into trouble in Ireland around the mid-1820s, which a lot of people were in the time, because the investment in the Irish economy from the Act of Union in the first half century was nil. The Griffiths had married into a lot of local families, and some of their own family had gone on to Dublin and studied medicine and law. Around the mid-1820s, it was believed that a Mark Griffith married a Catholic and was disinherited. He left and went to Dublin. A document actually discovered in 1847 showed that a Smith family, probably relations, paid for Arthur Griffith's father's education and apprenticeship. The Griffiths sold their last farm at Ballyhaise to the Newburghs in 1828, and it's probably after that they departed Ireland for Wales, the majority of them. Some family members stayed at Rockcorry, another at Napa near Shercock. The lands they settled on belonged to the Marquess of Londonderry. However, that family, they split, and some went to America and others left that estate and some had to go working in the mines in North Wales. Arthur Griffith was born in Dublin in 1871, was educated by the Christian Brothers and became absorbed in all things Irish, language, culturally, etc. Working as an apprentice printer, he soon became a very active journalist, promoting Ireland and Irishness. He had a soulmate and best friend in William Rooney, and they both commenced to publish the United Irishman in the mid-1890s. Due to health reasons, Griffith went to South Africa in 1897 and worked for approximately near 2 years there, and then returned to Dublin. But on his return, his friend died suddenly and Griffith was devastated. However, he continued to write and issue his papers on a shoestring. They were being noted by different classes of society in Dublin, including Dublin Castle, for their quality of writing. Griffith created his own society more by accident than design, known as Cumann na Gael, which covered most items that would be covered within his writings. The editorial in Griffith's United Irishman was read by a 12-year-old boy in West Cork. Michael Collins wrote in an essay for his teacher, Dennis Lyons at the time, "In Arthur Griffith there is a mighty force afoot in Ireland. He is none of the wildness of some I could name. In fact, there is an abundance of wisdom and awareness of things that are Ireland. The formation of Sinn Fein. When Arthur Griffith published his pamphlet entitled The Resurrection of Hungary in 1904, he put forward a political template for Ireland to gain self-government from Westminster and the Act of Union through political radicalism and civil disobedience. This was mirrored on the mayors of Hungary in the mid-19th century when they sought parliamentary autonomy from Vienna within the Austro-Hungarian Empire with a dual monarchy. The mayors' initial military campaign of 1851-52 was crushed. However, a man by the name of Franz Dieck, through political and silent disobedience, succeeded under what became known later as the 17-year bloodless war. Having attained the Hungarian parliament, the mayors' campaign was neither a success nor a failure, due to the many complexities of a country within an empire with so many different ethnic values. Griffith saw this campaign, in theory, as the best option for Ireland, where he debated against Ireland's many botched revolts against the Act of Union and the demise of Grattan's Parliament. It is highly probable that Griffith's dual monarchy concept reflected Unionist fears of full separation from Westminster as being expressed in Ulster against Gladstone's Home Rule bills of the time. With roots in South Ulster, Griffith would have been aware of Protestant fears and suspicions around political separatism from the Act of Union, while he and many others wanted a representative democracy for all of Ireland. The National Council of Sinn Fein was formed in 1905 from his McMonagle and based on the resurrection of Hungary and his many forward arguments for Ireland's economic and political freedom from the Empire. Griffith's principal argument for Irish independence, as written in his United Ireland, was the need for Irish policies and Irish produce to be labelled as such in the British market. And his main gripe was all the Irish money that was invested in Irish banks was being sold to English banks for higher interest rates rather than it being reinvested in Ireland to create jobs. His United Irishman paper shut down in 1906 because of litigation from a priest. In one of the earlier editions of Sinn Fein, he wrote, "We seriously wish to see the day when every Irishman shall be a citizen, whether Catholic or Protestant, equally interested in their country's welfare, possessing equal freedom and equal privileges, shall learn to look upon each other as brothers and children of the same God and the natives of the same land, and the only strife amongst them who shall serve their country best." It is accepted that Mary Butler, a cousin of Sir Edward Carson, who proposed the name Sinn Fein for Griffith's movement, a name that would become generic in every aspect of Ireland's fight for freedom in the early 20th century. Sinn Fein had been a name to a local paper actually in Oldcastle in the earlier days of the century, produced by a McKenna family. The first president of Sinn Fein from 1905 was Edward Martin from County Galway, and he was succeeded by John Sweetman of Meath. Griffith became president in 1911 until he handed the presidency to Eamon de Valera in 1917. Griffith preferred to work in the background, and his thinking was that de Valera would unite the political and the volunteers together under one umbrella. He was more of a backroomsman and preferred to stay there. Prior to the Easter Rising, Griffith and Sean McDermott were joint editors of Nationality, a paper of the IRB, when McDermott never told Griffith of the pending rising. When the 1916 rising broke out, Arthur Griffith was at home minding his children. Griffith's widow, Maud, testified to the Bureau of History in 1949 that before Sean McDermott was executed, he sent a message to Arthur by someone who was in the prison, asking him to forgive him for not having kept his promise to inform us about the rising. But he and others thought it right that it would be better not, so that Arthur would live and to keep the national movement alive. And I think that's very noteworthy. After the Easter Rising, some 3,700 Irish men and women were arrested and shipped to England in cattle boats, where they were dispersed to various camps, jails, etc. Some 1,800 men were interned at Frangach in North Wales, amongst whom was Michael Collins. Many were innocent and gradually were released. When David Lloyd George became British Prime Minister in 1916, he formed a new national government. The Irish internees had been reduced to hundreds in various camps and jails. Still, the majority were in Frangach. The new Westminster government had one objective, and that was to achieve an Allied victory in the war. While the Irish question still remained, Britain and Ireland needed American troops on the ground in Europe. As a gift to the people, Lloyd George released the Irishmen from Frangach and other jails, which appeared to have the purpose of appeasing Irish America and the influences of the US Democratic Party. Irish unionists were not pleased at the release of the prisoners, but yet they were placated with Sir Edward Carson with a place in Cabinet as Minister for War, and James Craig, a junior minister in the Treasury. John Redmond was offered a post, but he refused. Did the then Chief Constable of Caernarvonshire, John Griffith, influence Lloyd George to release the Irishmen from Frangach, which he always referred to as the Sinn Fein University? John Griffith claimed he was a direct descendant of the Griffiths who returned to Wales from Ireland, and he was claimed related by blood to Arthur Griffith. John Griffith was the first commoner to rise to the position of Chief Constable in Britain in any police force. He got that because he was a fluent Welsh speaker. That's a role that was normally held for somebody of the royalty or a retired army officer, someone of that character. It was believed it was John Griffith who christened Frangach the Sinn Fein University. The returning internees were rapturously received in Dublin at Christmas 1916, and the Sinn Fein political organisation, which had been sustained at Frangach, was soon to face its first political challenge in Ireland. A Westminster by-election would have to be held in North Roscommon. William O'Brien, the trade unionist, urged Sinn Féin to contest the seat and advised that Count George Plunkett should be their candidate. Count Plunkett, the father of the executed Joseph Mary Plunkett, had political representative ambitions in earlier years with the IPP, but they were rejected. But for the time being, he would be a very emotive Sinn Féin candidate. Because of his son's involvement in the rising, Plunkett had no regard for Griffith or Sinn Féin, and he had been, at the same time, rejected by many society in Dublin for that. Plunkett was nominated by O'Brien and seconded by Griffith to fight the seat, but as an independent. Plunkett paid very few visits to Roscommon for that general election because of very, very severe winter weather. But it was thanks to the priests, yes, the young priests, the curates, led by Father Michael O'Flanagan, who made sure that Plunkett won the seat, which he did with a good 4-figure majority. Police records from the time indicate that the police were absolutely frustrated at how the priests did conduct this election successfully. This was not Sinn Féin's first electoral contest. Charles Dolan from Manor Hamilton, the sitting MP for North Leitrim, retired his IPP seat at Westminster and membership of the party and stood for a by-election as a Sinn Féiner. This was a long and divisive by-election which Dolan lost. The Dolan family would be a major influence in the awareness of Sinn Féin and the revolutionary period in later years. His brother Charles' brother, Father Tom Dolan, when he was a seminarian in Maynooth, radicalised every student priest in the place. And his youngest brother, James Dolan, became parliamentary assistant to W.T. Cosgrove when elected chairman of the Executive Council of the Free State after the death of Griffith. Sinn Féin had 5 councillors elected to Dublin Corporation in 1909. And then in 1914, this was reduced to 2 seats because probably about the expectations of Home Rule. In the same month as Sinn Féin was winning its first political contest in North Roscommon, the Russian Revolution had commenced in St. Petersburg to overthrow the Tsarist regime. The USA sent troops into Europe in April as the people of Australia rejected conscription for the second time. Lloyd George announced that his 6 northeastern counties would be exempted from the Home Rule Bill. Michael Bertillo, former politician in England and now a television personality, recently commented on this as Carson and the Unionists demand the statement in writing, which they got. The partitioning of Ireland was now on the cards. Lloyd George set up his Irish Peace Conference in Trinity College in the heart of Sir Edward Carson's constituency. He was trying to convince the Empire and America that he was doing something for Ireland. This was an abject failure. Sinn Féin and the Irish political revolution was part of the changing world. Sinn Féin contested a by-election in South Longford, and where Joe McGuinness, who was in Lewis jail, was elected under the slogan from Collins, put him in to get him out. This election was only saved because Alex McCabe, another good Sinn Féiner, discovered a box hidden in that was counted, and he won by 10 votes. Sir Edward Carson in Cabinet, there was potential that all of Ulster could be excluded from the intended Home Rule Bill, as voted on by the House of Lords in 1914. Sinn Féin had to win influence in Ulster to push back Lloyd George's recent announcements to exclude 6 counties from the Home Rule Bill, which John Redmond strongly opposed at the 1914 Buckingham Palace Conference. In 1914, there was a general acceptance among Southern nationalists that counties Antrim, Down, Armagh and Derry, where the Union's population was on average about 65%, could be given some options to accept or reject Home Rule Bill. The suspensory bill of September 14 had saved the Third Home Rule Bill and perceived civil war in Ireland. Ascot's Home Bill of 1912, as intended, was now dying as partition loomed. Political activism in the province of Ulster was now a necessity. The next Westminster seat for Sinn Féin to contest would be likely to be East Cavan, where the sitting member, Samuel Young, had not been to Parliament for 3 years. Sean Milroy opened Sinn Féin's campaign in East Cavan on Ascension Day 1917. And on the following Sunday, he spoke at after-mass meetings at Cootehill and Modjabon. There was a wonderful supporter of Sinn Fein in Cootehill, Father O'Connell. There were divisions developing between the UIL and the UAH as the great supporters of the IPP, and they were melting towards Sinn Fein. From the many narratives over the years, Sean Milroy was, without exception, always referred to as the great organiser, as it can be gleaned from a Sinn Féin notice in the Anglo-Celt in June. A large gathering to whip up the district was held at Middle Chapel, Cootehill, where Mr Fidgeon agreed to work the Shercock area. Mr McCabe will look after Mulla, J.P. O'Brien will look after Kingscourt, and J.J. Lynch will look after Ballyjam's Duff. So time wasn't being lost in Cavan. In July, De Valera won Sinn Féin's third by-election in East Clare on the death of Willie Redmond. This loss of this seat was huge to the IPP. In the following month, W.T. Cosgrove won the by-election in Kilkenny. Sinn Féin was now growing rapidly. And just to give an example, at the 1st of January 1917, there were 5 Sinn Féin clubs in Cavan. But by year's end, there was 53 with approximately 2,600 members. Milroy was a veteran of the 1916 Rising and was a John the Baptist figure, paving the way for Sinn Féin President Arthur Griffith's first political visit to County Cavan and Ulster at Ballyconnell on the 15th of August. Griffith was welcomed by thousands of people from Cavan, Fermanagh and Leitrim, bands and banners and a carnival atmosphere. The date was selected because it was the Feast of the Assumption, which was a traditional day for the ancient order of Hibernians to hold their main demonstrations in Ulster. Sinn Féin were targeting their structure. Griffith's first visit to County Cavan was originally planned for Belturbet, but it being a garrison town, the meeting was reorganised for Ballyconnell because Griffith would avoid any trouble or potential trouble at any cost. In his opening address at Ballyconnell, Griffith said, "The sending of the Irish representatives to the British Parliament is a recognition of the British right to rule Ireland, and it's a basic error of Irish politics because it turned the minds of the people from their own strengths. The Sinn Féin policy is clear and distinct, that the Irish people are by national right and by international right a free people, that anything that obstructs the freedoms is tyranny and must be removed, and the way Sinn Féin propose to remove it, tyranny, is the non-recognition of English authority in Ireland." After speaking on increasing taxation and the fall in the population, Griffith Continues, Sinn Féin tells the people, the Irish, to turn their backs on England, to deny the country's right to rule them, to elect supporters for that policy for the Parliament constituency and representatives on councils, and have done that, they will set up a constituent assembly, an acting government of Ireland, endowed with the moral authority of the Irish people. Griffith spoke on the embargoes on Irish cattle going to England because of foot and mouth restrictions from 3 years previously, while the Irish Parliamentary Party did nothing about it. He cited John Dolan for his impotence of parliamentarianism while commenting on better markets for Irish cattle in Germany and Italy. The question here was, wasn't Griffith ahead of his time vis-a-vis free trade in Europe? On the following day, Griffith met many Sinn Féin activists in Drums and Ballyconnell, including some Protestant people, which would be contrary to some contemporary Republican thinking. He requested John Drum, my grandfather, to be a judge in the yet-to-be-established Sinn Féin arbitration and district courts. Griffith returned to Dublin to continue his political work. The Irish nationalist Alice Stopford Green arranged an interview with Griffith for the English writer Una Birch Pope Hennessy to meet with Griffith, and she later wrote, and I quote, "Mr. Griffith, editor of Nationality, taken up on the Easter Rising, nearly shot, 8 months in jail in England, looked upon as a Napoleonic type, short, stocky, strong, optimistic, and not Irish in appearance. A passionate Sinn Feiner and wielding great influence. He said Ireland was reading as she never read before. Everyone was constitutional making. Pamphlets on political subjects were intensely in demand, impossible to compete with the supply of literature or lectures. 600 branches of Sinn Fein founded since June 1, a contagion spreading throughout the country. He was taken up with a lot of others and placed with 68 men in a room at Richmond Barracks. The attitude of the soldiers made him a bad impression. Griffith said that the British government expected us to be grateful for them for being let out of prison. After 8 months, it shows the stupidity. If the government did not want a tremendous stimulus in the Sinn Féin movement, they most certainly ought to have kept us here until the end of the war. So stupid does Sinn Féin think of the actions of the British government that some amongst them are convinced that it has been done in order to stir up rebellion, which will be given an excuse for ruthless separation. Griffith returned and visited Clones on the 25th of August, where he spoke to 5,000 people in St Tiernock's Park. At Coothill on the 3rd of September, Griffith, De Valera, Father O'Connell, Walter Cole and Jean Mulroy spoke to an estimated 10,000 people in a monster rally. This was literally Sinn Féin's opening salvo to fight the East Cavan seat when it became vacant. There were 23 priests on the platform, and they would soon be barred from Sinn Féin platforms by the Bishop of Kilmore, Dr. Finnegan. G.V. Maloney read their address of welcome on behalf of the Town Council. Paul Smith, Secretary of the Sinn Féin Club, read the resolution. He was followed by Father O'Connell, who, in raising the crowd, "I've only got to say, Sinn Féin, that it is a tonic in the air. It has cleared the air and is sweeping corruption out of the land." He introduced Arthur Griffith as a Cavan man, the father of Sinn Féin, who was engaged today by voice and pen in accomplishing the resurrection of Ireland. Griffith and De Valera spoke on the Sinn Féin policies while condemning John Redmond and his party. Looking north, both men appealed to their fellow Irishmen of the northeast not to lose their Irishness. On pending partition, Griffith quoted Reuters news agency. 3 days ago, England sent to America and other countries an account of a diabolical plot on the part of the German government to divide Belgium into two areas, Flemish and Walloon. And the object, the English said, was a vile partition trick to destroy the national unity of Belgium. The English government that sent out this accusation against Germany is the same government that attempted a vile partition trick on Ireland 12 months ago. And believe me, we have not heard the last of that trick. As National Organiser, Sean Mulroy spoke on organisation and discipline. He wanted Cavan to be the banner county of Ulster. Let Sinn Féin clubs be formed in every centre and look after the register. You will have to look after the peace yourselves and see that the reputation for order and good conduct that has followed the banner of Sinn Féin since it was first flung to the skies in Roscommon shall be maintained. We want every Sinn Féiner to be a good Irishman with a high standard of civic and national patriotism. Sinn Féin was growing throughout the formation of clubs throughout rural Cavan and Fermanagh. In Fermanagh, nationalists had won control of Fermanagh County Council in 1914. A major Sinn Féin rally was organised for Enniskillen in mid-October, but on a rumour that there was going to be orange disorder and interference or violence, Griffith said, "No, I won't attend," to avoid confrontation. One of the most strategic things done by the Sinn Féin movement in County Cavan was the establishment of the Sinn Féin Parish or Arbitration and Appeal Courts. This was at a meeting of the joint executives of East and West Cavan in the Town Hall Cavan on the 30th of September 1917, when the executives put the following motion before the 32 clubs present: that the joint executives of East and West Cavan Sinn Fein clubs hereby formulate a board of arbitration whose function shall be to amicably settle all disputes between members in all matters of either finance, property or person. To put the scheme on a working basis, it is proposed to appoint in each parish 3 reliable and trusted arbitrators, one of whom may be a parish priest or curate, and the other 2 men officers of the Sinn Fein Club, to whom all disputes shall be referred. That the several executives shall appoint 3 members each as appeal court judges, to whom any aggrieved party may appeal the findings of the parish court. The Executive Appeal Court shall have the entire force of the Sinn Féin movement, financially and otherwise, to reinforce the rewards. That the Executive of each county in Ireland be furnished with a copy of this resolution in order to do likewise, and therefore to deny law costs to the Crown and all traffic at all avoidable English courts. Discussion around this motion indicated that Sinn Féin clubs were already dealing with agrarian disputes in King's Court and Swadlin's Bar. The motion was passed and it was adopted into the Sinn Féin constitution the following October. The objectives of the court's policy was to report and solve agrarian disputes, which Dublin authorities quietly accepted, as the thought and hope that these courts would end up in bitter land disputes and bring down the Sinn Féin movement. The underlying Sinn Féin objective was to dilute police power in Ireland and to weaken the British court system while establishing a first new rung of Irish administration. With 3 prominent officers from the local Sinn Féin acting as court arbitrators in the community, the Sinn Féin movement was making an effective presence while building political roots. The people, including many Protestant community and the legal profession, supported these courts. The policy had an extended function to advise property owners to make wills. Protestant landowners whose inheritance were entailed asked the Sinn Féin courts to arbitrate to avoid potential disputes later, and agreements with legal representatives were registered in the forecourts. Many solicitors represented clients, while lay advocacy was also common. Quoting British law was frowned, although there was often comments towards British courts. But Brehon law and the law of the United States could be quoted. Originally, the Sinn Féin courts were held in camera and were the precursors of the Dáil courts, which went public from June 1920. On a personal note, I recalling many conversations with my late mother on the Troubles, when she referred to those changing times in Ireland on which she had much to say. When cross-checked, in essence, she was correct. I did question her as a schoolboy when many important people with files under their arms were called to see her. Thinking that there was something wrong, or what you say, you wouldn't understand. In retirement, she disclosed that her late father, as president of the Ballyconn Sinn Féin Club, did a lot of work among people of all persuasion, advising them to make and change wills. This was apparently successful, and consequently he was made executor of such wills on trust and integrity. However, my grandfather died in September 23, and in his will he left his own property to my grandmother and a small farm to one of his sons. When my grandmother died in 1934, my mother was one of her executors, which in turn made her an executor of her own father's will. This necessitated visits from many legal people to her from the late 1950s and into the 1970s. Some of these solicitors were from Protestant practices, and my mother kept the integrity of all these signatures to herself. There were complexities dealt with successfully in the case of some entailed wills amongst Church of Ireland families, and from her memory were registered but regretfully destroyed in the burning of the Four Courts. Her proudest moment was Arthur Griffith visiting her home and appointing her father a judge of the Sinn Fein courts. The legal profession in the main went along with these courts, and they became the Dáil courts from 1920 when they went public. During the summer, the Dáil courts in County Cavan, during that summer, the Dáil courts were openly active. A Sinn Fein court hearing was disrupted by the RIC, a military at Carrigallen, that's at Mountain Lodge, where the solicitors in attendance were stopped and asked for their papers. T.J. Duffy, solicitor, spoke to the military, stating, "The Incorporated Law Society, of which the Lord Chancellor is the head, had no objection to solicitors attending the Sinn Fein courts." The military officer said, "What Mr. Duffy had to say had no effect here." That'll be under Dora. The Incorporated Law Society, of which the Lord Chancellor is head, had no objections to solicitors attending the Sinn Fein courts. The military officer said that Mr. Duffy had to say that had no effect. A major report of the Parish Court in Arva was being disrupted was also reported. Colonel Ashley, an MP at Westminster, put a question on the Sinn Fein courts to the Attorney General at Westminster. In the same month, when he raised the issue to legal representation in the courts, Ashley asked, "What could happen to those barristers and solicitors who took part in illegal proceedings?" The Attorney General replied, "That is a matter in the case of barristers for the King's Inn and the case of solicitors for the Incorporated Law Society." To which Ashley responded, "Am I to understand that the Crown has no power to deal with barristers or solicitors who have taken part in treasonable or illegal proceedings?" There was no reply. Now we introduce, and you can look at a book that was only discovered in an attic in Dublin a few months back, and it is the report of for 10 months from November 21 until September 22 of the Parish Arbitration Courts in the parish of Drumlane. It's a very interesting document, and it's a treasure to get something like that as a record of these local issues. I have to thank Niall O'Reilly for bringing it to my attention, and it certainly will be looked after. The new year came and the Great War continued when in April 1918 a decision was made at Westminster to extend military conscription to Ireland. Every Republican and nationalist in Ireland opposed it, including the Catholic Church. The issue had a temporary unifying influence on all nationalists, and this put a lull in the campaigning in Cavan. The imposition of military conscription by Lord George was a major political issue for the vast majority in Ireland. In the same month, the sitting MP, Samuel Young, died at the age of 96. He was a Protestant nationalist and a person of every aspect of his character, who was always referred to as an adherent of O'Connell's policies on repeal of the Union, and he always advocated that. Sean Milroy assembled a Sinn Fein meeting in Coothill and declared that Griffith would contest the vacant seat. Duffy, the solicitor from Kingscourt, was appointed election agent for him. Now, there's normally, at the time, as the East Cavan election was going to be contentious, in that when a member of a party dies, normally within days, a member of his party proposes the holding of a by-election, which in turn would be held within maybe 7 or 10 days. But this didn't happen in the case of East Cavan. It was June before a writ was put up before, and that was put up by Green of the All for Ireland party. So it was up and running. Griffith would fight the East Cavan, and John F. O'Hanlon, the editor of the Anglo-Celt, would be the IPP candidate. It was the first election held in East Cavan for 26 years, first democratically elected. So that was unique in itself. And Griffith was elected very successfully with more than a four-figure sum. So that was it. The German plot was huge. One Sunday during the campaign, the IPP had 24 sitting MPs drafted into constituency, while Sinn Fein had small and local rallies. Griffith was called a shirker because he wasn't involved in the 1916 rising. But then during the military authorities arrested Griffith and many prominent Sinn Féiner under the German plot. They were detained without trial, and the campaign in Ireland against conscription, unionists, churches were all against it. And Sinn Féin was accused were planning a second rising, which was being backed by German money and arms. The plot had been rumoured for some time and probably went back to the failed attempt of Roger Casement in 1916. The 1918 general election to Westminster has been regarded by many historians as Ireland's defining act in establishing self-determination. Ireland had to fill 105 seats from 103 constituencies, which Sinn Féin would contest on its election manifesto of October 18. Sinn Féin had grown in strength in Cavan, which was evident when Arthur Griffith and Peter Paul Galligan's nomination papers were presented in the respective electoral areas. The Anglo-Celt paper reported extensively on these, and I thought it was very appropriate that at the council chambers in Cavan Courthouse, over 30 nominating papers for Peter Paul Galligan were presented, and at 2 p.m. Mr. Burrows from the balcony of the courthouse declared Mr. Galligan returned unopposed. After a vote of thanks to the High Sheriff, the crowd present sang the Soldier's Song from the balcony. In all probability, the first time it was sung in Cavan Courthouse. From the number of papers signed, that he had about 6,000 signatures. The one disturbing factor of the Sinn Féin election that time was in North Fermanagh, where the nationalist voters would not vote for the original Sinn Féin candidate, where nationalist voters refused to vote for the original Sinn Féin candidate George Irwin, who was a member of the Church of Ireland and a veteran who fought in Dublin in 1916 with the South Dublin Union. Irwin was a known Gaelic churchman who had campaigned to have services given in the Irish language in his church. The AOH in Fermanagh refused to support him under Cardinal Logue's pact because they would not vote for a Protestant. Kevin O'Sheil, a late replacement for the Sinn Féin candidate North Fermanagh, and he contested a seat very tightly. Catholic sectarianism was obviously alive and well in Fermanagh, which played into Orange hands. According to O'Sheil in his testimony to the Bureau of Military History, where he states, if Irvin had stood in North Fermanagh, he could have won the seat in Fermanagh, and Fermanagh may not have been partitioned. Unionists had no problem in supporting their Catholic candidate, Dennis Henry. Sinn Féin went on to win 73 seats under its abstentionist policy in the general election. This led to the first Dáil meeting in the Mansion House in January 1919. The first meeting was attended by 29 of the elected TDs, and most of them were either on the run or in English jails. The international press was present. Regretfully, before the first Dáil sat, 2 RIC policemen were shot dead by volunteers in County Tipperary as they escorted explosive materials to a quarry works. This incident is looked upon as the start of Ireland's War of Independence, an act which, in total contradiction to the political principles so well fought for by Sinn Féin at the ballot box. On Griffith leading the plenipotentiaries to negotiate and sign the Anglo-Irish Treaty in December 21 and make the following points, which were to be controversial, leading to the split in Sinn Féin and the Civil War. Ireland had already been partitioned, 6 months earlier. After lengthy negotiations, the oath to the monarch was diluted to an oath to the Constitution of the Irish Free State, and faithfulness to the King was secondary. The Unionists of the Free State had to be given some recognition through these wordings. Lord Middleton did much to have Britain sign the truce. The Republic. Griffith said to De Valera before leaving Dublin, "You know, and I know, we cannot bring back a republic." The Irish had never defined what a republic meant or what kind of a republic they wanted. It was never fully acknowledged that Ireland's neutrality stemmed from the Anglo-Irish Treaty. Sir Robert Horne, a senior British politician, delivered a very interesting speech in Washington on Ireland and the Statute of Westminster, saying, "The Irish Free State could itself decide the attitude and policy it would pursue in the event of Britain or any other state of the Commonwealth being involved in war. Here then lies the constitutional grounds and authority which has enabled the present Irish government to proclaim and maintain neutrality." I'm going to end there, and all I can say is I could have said an awful lot more, but we have to be grateful to Griffith for what he did. And I'll finish with the quote. Irish political history, and indeed academic historians, have tended to airbrush Arthur Griffith, the father figure of Dáil Éireann, out of Ireland's contemporary history. Regretfully, he was taken too soon from the vision he had created over 3 decades. When compared to the many of his time, Griffith was the only one who had an economic vision and policies. He was the one man who did most for Ireland while receiving little. In the words of Harry Boland after Griffith's funeral, and in the presence of Michael Collins, Richard Mulcahy, Dr. Pat McCartan and others, Boland said, "Damn it, didn't he make us all?" And I'll take a quote from Michael Collins' sister in 1971, who said, "I feel terribly upset about Arthur Griffith being ignored. It's all right for Michael, he's a sort of a hero, but poor Mr. Griffith has been ignored." The people of County Cavan and their passive spirit and ability to recognise that what was right stood for and by Griffith Sinn Fein when requested. Thank you.